The sky was overcast with gray clouds, and a light drizzle fell over the headstones, casting a somber tone on the funeral. Carl, 58 years old, stood beside his father's casket, watching as it was slowly lowered into the ground. The flowers around the grave were wet, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. The people gathered seemed as distant as Carl's thoughts. He wasn't crying. For him, grief felt like something far away, almost impersonal. Carl had never been close to his father. After his mother died when Carl was 20, their relationship had grown even colder. His father threw himself into work, and Carl did the same, following a similar path but always at a distance, as if there were an invisible barrier neither of them was willing to cross. The farewell words echoed in Carl's mind as he reflected on the emptiness he felt. It wasn't the emptiness of loss, but rather a void formed by living an entire life in the shadow of someone he never really knew. Their relationship had been based on social conventions, never genuine affection. As Carl tried to process these feelings, he noticed a young man silently approaching. The man looked out of place among the others. He was dressed simply, and his eyes were full of tears. Carl didn't recognize him. Without saying a word, the young man stopped in front of Carl, holding a small box in his hands. Their eyes met briefly before the man quickly looked away and handed Carl the box. The young man said nothing. He just handed Carl the box, bowed his head, and before Carl could ask anything, he turned and slowly walked away, blending into the crowd. Carl watched, confused, as the young man disappeared. Who was he? And why had he given Carl that box? Carl looked down at the box in his hands. It was small, old, and wooden, with a lock that wasn't fastened. He felt intrigued and somewhat unsettled. But this wasn't the time or place to deal with it. He slipped the box into his coat pocket and turned his attention back to the rest of the ceremony. Yet, the thought of that young man and the contents of the box wouldn't leave his mind. As the funeral continued, Carl grew more and more restless. The words of the priest drifted by unnoticed as he kept wondering what might be in that box and who the young man was. The funeral finally ended, and after saying goodbye to a few acquaintances, Carl decided to go home and open the box, hoping it might reveal some meaning to that cloudy, uncertain day. Back in his apartment, Carl felt a certain relief as he closed the door behind him. The silence was welcome after the emotional whirlwind of the funeral. He took off his coat and glanced at the small box still in his hand. A part of him hesitated to open it, but his curiosity was stronger. Carl sat down in his armchair, placed the box on the coffee table, and stared at it for a moment. Something about that encounter at the funeral felt strange. Who was that young man? And why had he been crying? With a sigh, Carl finally decided to find out what was inside. He opened the box slowly, feeling the old wood creak under his fingers. Inside was a small collection of aged items. The first thing that caught his attention was a bundle of yellowed photographs. As he picked them up, Carl saw that they were images of his father, much younger, standing next to a woman he didn't recognize. She was smiling, with one hand resting on the shoulder of a small boy. The boy looked about 3 or 4 years old. Carl furrowed his brow, trying to figure out who these people were. He knew most of his father's friends and colleagues, but these faces were completely unfamiliar. There was something unsettling about the collection of images. He flipped through a few more photos, all showing the same trio: his father, the unknown woman, and the boy. A chill ran down his spine as Carl set the photos aside and found a small set of documents at the bottom of the box. Among them was one that stood out. It was a birth certificate, old and yellowed but still legible. He picked it up, and as he read the child's name, his heart began to race. The name on the birth certificate was John, and where the father's name should be, there it was in clear letters. His own father's name. Carl blinked in disbelief. For a moment, the document seemed wrong, as if he were imagining things. But there was no mistake. His father, who had always seemed so distant, had another child. John. The name echoed in Carl's mind. Who was John? And why had his father never mentioned him? The questions multiplied in Carl's head as he tried to process this shocking discovery. His father had had another family and it seemed had abandoned them. Carl now understood why the young man at the funeral had looked so emotional. John was his brother, a brother he had never known existed. Carl took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions flooding his mind. Betrayal, curiosity, sadness. The images of that woman and the small boy now made sense. They were part of the life his father had kept secret, a life Carl had never known existed. And now John, the boy in the photos, was a grown man who had come to the funeral to deliver this shocking revelation. What would Carl do with this new information? He felt lost, unsure if he should seek out John or simply leave this secret buried, as his father had probably intended. But one thing was certain: the box had changed everything. The days following the discovery of John were marked by an oppressive silence in Carl's life. He felt consumed by thoughts he couldn't organize. The box with the photos and documents now sat on his table, and every time he passed by, his eyes landed on it, bringing with it a flood of unanswered questions. Why had his father never mentioned John? How could he have hidden a family for so many years? And why had John delivered the box at the funeral? It was clear John knew who Carl was, but what had he been expecting with that gesture? Carl tried to focus on his daily routine, going back to work and handling his usual tasks. But nothing could shake the feeling that something important was missing. He had spent his life believing he knew his father, even though they had been emotionally distant. Now, with John's revelation, it felt as though the image Carl had of his father had been completely shattered. Every memory seemed tainted by the discovery of this secret. In the middle of a restless night, Carl found himself staring at the woman beside his father, smiling warmly, looked happy. And the boy, John, now he knew, was looking at the camera with an innocent expression, not knowing that his future would be marked by abandonment. Carl wondered how John had grown up. What must life have been like for someone left behind? He thought about his own life, comfortable and structured, and felt a sharp pang of guilt. While he had the advantages of growing up with his father's resources, John clearly hadn't been as fortunate. The young man who had appeared at the funeral seemed worn down, emotionally exhausted. Carl couldn't begin to imagine what John had gone through, but something inside him pushed him to find out. Carl hesitated, struggling with the idea of seeking out John. Part of him wanted to keep his distance, as though ignoring the problem might make it disappear. But another part, stronger now, felt it was his duty to learn more about the brother he never knew he had. Then there was the box, John's silent plea at the funeral. It felt like an invitation for Carl to take the next step. Determined not to run from the truth any longer, Carl prepared himself to learn more about John. He had no idea how their meeting would unfold, but he knew he needed answers. Maybe if he found John, he could finally understand why their father had made such drastic decisions. With this in mind, Carl picked up the phone and began searching for clues about John. He needed to know Carl knew the truth wouldn't be easy to hear, but now his need for answers was stronger than his reluctance to confront the past. With the information obtained from the documents in the box and some basic research, Carl was able to locate the neighborhood where John lived. It was a modest place, far removed from the comfort and security Carl had always known. As he drove through the narrow, poorly maintained streets, Carl noticed the stark contrast between their lives. John had grown up in a world completely different from his. Every corner Carl turned, every rundown building he passed, made the weight on his shoulders grow heavier. He wondered what it must have been like to grow up in a place like this, without the privileges he had so often taken for granted. It was a strange feeling of guilt, mixed with empathy for someone he had never known, but now shared a blood bond with. Finally, he pulled up in front of the building where, according to his research, it was a simple structure, with faded walls and signs of neglect. Carl stood still for a few moments, staring at the entrance. He wondered if John would be home, and more importantly, if he would be willing to talk. With a deep breath, Carl got out of the car and climbed the stairs to John's apartment. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door before he finally knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet hallway, For a brief moment, everything remained silent. But then Carl heard footsteps approaching from the other side of the door. The door slowly creaked open, and there stood John, thinner and more worn than Carl remembered from the funeral. His eyes were filled with distrust, and he didn't seem surprised to see Carl. It was as if he had been expecting this to happen. "You came," John said, his voice cold and distant. Carl gave a small nod, unsure of how to begin. I needed time to process what I... John crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, making no gesture to invite Carl in. "And what do you want now?" The question caught Carl off guard. He had come seeking answers, but at that moment he realized that perhaps John was also seeking something, or maybe he had long since stopped expecting anything from Carl or their father. "I want to understand," Carl finally said. "I want to understand why our father never told me about you, and why he left you." For a moment, John said. His eyes narrowed slightly as he sized Carl up. After a heavy silence, he opened the door a little wider. "Come in." Carl stepped into the small apartment, noticing the simplicity of the place. It was modest but clean. John pointed to a nearby chair and sat in another facing Carl. The tension in the air was thick, as if both were waiting for the other to make the next move. "I knew about you," John suddenly said, breaking the silence. "My mother told me. I knew you existed, knew he had another, but I never looked for you, because I knew he chose you." Carl felt the impact of John's words. He realized that John carried years of resentment, not just toward their father, but also for everything he had never had. Carl tried to explain. "I didn't know. I never knew you existed until the funeral." John let out a bitter laugh. "Of course you didn't. He didn't want you to know." Silence fell between them once more. Carl felt lost, unsure of how to continue the conversation. There was so much that needed to be said, but there weren't enough words to bridge the gap between them. All Carl knew was that somehow, he needed to find a way to repair the damage their father had caused, even if he himself wasn't the one responsible. John took a deep breath, as if preparing to say something he had been holding on to for a long time. "I've spent my life trying to understand why he left me. Why he chose you. Your mother. Your life. Meanwhile, my mom and we struggled to sue." Each word John spoke weighed heavier on Carl's heart. He tried to form a response, but nothing he could say would change what had already been done. It was like trying to stitch up an old wound that would never heal. "I didn't know you existed," Carl repeated, hoping in some way that might ease the impact of John's pain. "If I had known..." John shook his head, cutting Carl off. "If you had known, what would you have done? You were the son he chose. And me? I was forgotten, abandoned. My mother, she spent years waiting for him, but he never came back. He never cared about how we were doing." John's voice trembled slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "She died alone, Carl, and I had to bury her by myself." Carl leaned back in his chair, a wave of guilt crashing over him. He had always believed his life was simple. His father was a man of few words, but reliable. Now that image was completely shattered. The father he thought he knew had hidden a devastating secret, and Carl didn't know how to handle it. John looked straight at Carl, his eyes filled with deep pain. "I've always wondered what your life was like. Did you know about me and just choose to ignore it? Was I just an inconvenient memory for our father?" "No," Carl quickly responded, his voice firm. "I didn't know. I swear, John. If I had known, I would have done something. I don't know what, but I'm sorry." For a moment, John remained silent, processing Carl's words. Finally, he gave a slight nod, though his face remained tense. "It's hard to believe that. It's hard to accept that he could do this and just move on like nothing happened." Carl sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation deepen. "I can't change what he did, and I can't pretend to understand what you went through. But I want to try. I want to try to understand, and if possible, make up for what I can. John stared at Carl for a long moment before finally relaxing a little, though the tension still lingered. I've spent years trying to figure it out, and now, finally meeting you, I don't know what to do with that. Carl didn't know what to say. The silence between them felt heavy, each of them processing the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The small apartment felt stifling, not just because of its modest size, but because of the dense, bitter history it held. I don't know what to do with it either, Carl admitted, breaking the silence. But I want to try. John remained still for a few moments before slowly nodding. Me too, but I don't know if it's going to be easy. It doesn't have to be, Carl said softly. But we can start somewhere. John nodded again, though his expression remained cautious. There was a long road ahead, but at least both of them were willing to take the first step. After leaving John's apartment, Carl returned home with his mind swirling with thoughts. He didn't know if the meeting had been a success or a failure. All he knew was that the conversation with John had deeply affected him. Back in the safety of his apartment, Carl sat in the familiar armchair that had comforted him after many long, exhausting days at work. But now, the exhaustion he felt was different. It wasn't physical. It was emotional, mental. He felt drained, as though the weight of years of ignorance had come crashing down on him all at once. He stared into the emptiness for a few minutes, replaying John's expression when he talked about his mother. It hit Carl in an unexpected way. That young man had buried his own mother alone, without the support of a father, without the support of a brother. Carl couldn't imagine how that had shaped John, but he knew that John carried a deep scar that would never fully heal. Carl wondered if he was ready for what lay ahead. Building a relationship with John felt like a monumental task. The past they shared, or rather, the past Carl hadn't known about, separated them like an unbridgeable chasm. And yet, Carl knew he had to keep trying. But why did this matter so much now? Why couldn't he just move on with his life, leave John and his story in the past, just as their father had clearly done? Carl had spent his life avoiding emotional conflicts. He lived a practical, organized, and predictable life. All of that, however, had been destroyed by the revelation of John. Now he found himself immersed in a situation he couldn't control, in a sea of emotions he didn't know how to navigate. Carl's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. He answered automatically, without checking who it was. Hello? His voice sounded distant. Hey Carl, it's me, John. Carl was surprised. He hadn't expected John to reach out so soon. There was a pause before, I've been thinking about our conversation and I think you deserve to know more about what happened with my mom. Maybe it'll help you understand why I feel the way I do. Carl felt a tightness in his chest, but he agreed. I want to hear it, John. I really do. John's voice sounded less tense now. Great. Can we meet tomorrow? I think it's time you knew everything. Carl agreed, feeling a mixture of anxiety and determination. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was Rhea. After hanging up, Carl looked out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was about to face a part of his life that had been neglected for years. It wasn't just about John. It was about himself and how he had chosen to live his life up to this point. Carl knew this was going to change everything. The next afternoon, Carl made his way back to the same neighborhood where he had met John before. This time his anxiety was more controlled, and he mentally prepared himself for whatever was to come. As he finally parked the car and approached John's door, something felt different. There was less tension in his chest, as if he was more ready to face whatever lay ahead. John greeted him with a nod, still reserved but with a slight openness that hadn't been there before. The apartment looked the same as last time, simple and modest. This time, John offered Carl some coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, a subtle but telling sign that the atmosphere between them had shifted, even if just a little. I don't know if I'll ever really understand what our father did, Carl began, looking down at the coffee cup in front of him. "But I want to understand more about you, John. I want to know how you lived. I want to know about your mother and what happened to both of you." John sighed and stared out the window for a few moments before turning back to face Carl. "My mom, she was strong, Carl. She raised me on her own. When I was little, she didn't say much about our father. She just told me he had another family and that he wasn't coming back. But as I got older, I started to understand what that really meant." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "My mom worked 2 jobs to support us. It wasn't easy. I knew our father was out there living another life and that you, Carl, were part of that life. When I hit my teenage years, that's when it hit me the hardest. I was angry, really angry. Why did he leave us? Why wasn't I good enough for him?" Carl listened in silence, feeling the weight of John's words. The anger, the pain, the abandonment. All of it was right there, clear and raw. He had never thought about how his comfortable life stood in such sharp contrast to what John had endured. "And," Carl asked carefully, "how did she handle it?" John looked down at the floor, his expression hardening. "She never got over it, I guess. She kept hoping, right up until the end, that he'd change his mind and come back to us. But he never did. And that destroyed her. She got sick and I did what I could, but in the end it was just me. I had to deal with everything alone. I buried my mother, dealt with the loneliness, and after that, I just existed somehow. I survived." Carl felt a wave of guilt wash over him. The weight of his father's decisions was etched into every word John spoke, and Carl knew that while he wasn't directly responsible, he carried the emotional legacy of what their father had done. "I didn't know he had done that," Carl said quietly. "I didn't know how much he hurt you, or how much he destroyed your mother's life. But John, I want to do things differently. I know I can't change the past, but we can start fresh somehow. You don't have to." John was silent for a long time, considering Carl's words. There was an internal battle raging inside him. Part of John wanted to believe Carl, to accept his offer of reconnection, but another part, the part that had been hurt so many times, kept him from fully opening up. I don't know, Carl," John finally replied, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "It's hard to trust after all of this." "I understand," Carl responded immediately, "and I'm not asking you to trust me right away, but I want to be here for you. I can't fix what happened, but I want to build something new with you." John nodded slowly, still processing what that meant for him. "It'll take time. I'm not sure I can fully trust anyone after everything." "I know," Carl said, "but I'm willing to try if you are." The tension between them seemed to ease, even if only slightly. Carl knew that the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time he felt like he had taken a real step toward something. And for now, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Carl and John began seeing each other regularly. At first, their meetings were brief and filled with cautious conversations. Both were still learning how to navigate the turbulent waters of their newly discovered relationship. And while progress was slow, there was a growing sense of respect between them. Carl gradually came to understand more about John's life, the challenges he faced on a daily basis. John worked temporary jobs, struggling to pay the bills and maintain a stable life. He rejected any offer of financial help from Carl, insisting that he wanted to make his own way. For Carl, this was frustrating, but he respected John's decision and tried to offer emotional support instead, something he knew John needed, even if he wasn't yet ready to admit it. Slowly, their conversations became more personal. John started sharing stories from his childhood, memories of his mother, and Carl in turn shared his own childhood memories, but always with a sense of disconnect, now knowing how much his father had kept from him. During one of their meetings, John revealed something Carl hadn't expected. "I thought about looking for you when I was younger. I figured maybe, if I found you, you could help me understand why he left me, but I never had the courage." Carl felt a pang in his chest as he heard this. He looked at John, imagining the teenager who had stayed silent, dealing alone with questions that had never been answered. "I wish I'd known sooner, John. I wish I could have done something to help you." "I know," John replied with a sigh. "But it's too late to change what happened. We can only try to move forward now." That was the crucial point for both of them. Neither could change the past, but there was something new growing between them. Something that couldn't be erased or ignored. With each meeting, Carl felt the bond with John growing stronger. It was a slow process filled with ups and downs, but it was happening. One night, while they were walking through a park after one of their meetings, John finally said something Carl had been waiting to hear. "I never thought it would be possible to connect with you, Carl. I always thought we'd be strangers forever. But now, I don't know. I think we can try to be brothers. For real." Carl stopped for a moment, surprised by John's honest confession. "I want that, John. I really do. Let's try." John gave a small smile, something rare until that point, and nodded. "Let's try." As they continued walking under the dim park lights, Carl felt, for the first time, that they were both ready to start over. John wasn't just a memory from the past Carl never knew. He was his brother, and together, they would begin to rebuild what their father had torn apart. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between Carl and John continued to grow, albeit slowly. There were still many layers of distrust and pain that needed to be worked through, but the progress was clear. John was beginning to open up more, and Carl, in turn, was learning to be patient. He knew he couldn't rush the process or fix everything all at once. What was being built between them wasn't based on apologies or regret, but rather on a new attempt to establish the bond their father had. One sunny afternoon, Carl and John met again at the park where they had talked the last time. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been on previous occasions, and both of them seemed more at ease in each other's presence. As they walked side by side, Carl looked over at John, noticing how much the young man had changed in such a short time. There was a strength in him, a resilience that Carl deeply admired. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," John began, breaking the silence. "About our father, about what he did. And I think for a long time I let it consume me. I let the resentment guide me, but maybe it's time to let that go." Carl nodded, understanding the weight of John's words. "I think you're right. We'll never have all the answers, John. But that doesn't mean we have to keep living in the past. We can start fresh, if that's what you want." John looked out at the horizon, thoughtful. "I do want that, Carl. I think, for the first time, I'm ready to move on. I'm not going to pretend that everything's fixed because it's not, but I think I can try to live a life that isn't defined by what our father did or didn't do." Carl felt a genuine sense of relief hearing that. The journey with John had been full of challenges and uncertainties, but now he felt they were finally ready to begin a new chapter. There was a mutual understanding, an acknowledgement that both of them were willing to move forward, even with the scars of the past. They walked in silence for a few more minutes, appreciating the peace of the moment. Carl felt that the bond between them, though still fragile, was real. It was a new chance, and he had no intention of wasting it. "You know," John said suddenly, "for a long time I thought I didn't have anyone. I thought I was alone in the world, but now, I don't think I am anymore." Carl smiled, feeling a warm wave of emotion spread through his chest. "You're not alone, John. And you never will be again." John smiled back, and in that moment something shifted between them. It wasn't just an empty promise. It was a confirmation that, despite everything they had been through, they were ready to start over. Not as strangers, but as brothers. In the days that followed, Carl and John continued to meet, gradually building a relationship that neither of them had ever imagined was possible. There were moments of difficulty, of course. The past couldn't be forgotten so easily, but John was determined not to let it define who he was. And Carl, for his part, was committed to supporting John in whatever way he could. The bond between them was, at its core, A choice. A conscious decision to leave behind the broken legacy of their father and create something new. They both knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they weren't alone anymore. One afternoon, as John and Carl were walking together, John stopped and looked at Carl with a calm smile on his face. "I never thought I'd say this, but I think I can finally call you my brother." Carl felt a deep surge of emotion at hearing those words. He didn't need to say anything in response, just smiled and placed a hand on Jan's shoulder. The silence that followed was comforting, filled with understanding. They had come a long way since that initial meeting at the funeral. The past was still there and always would be, but now the future seemed brighter. Both of them knew that the relationship they were building would be based on respect, acceptance, and, most importantly, the desire to be brothers. And for Carl and John, that was enough. Don't forget to click on the card above to watch more stories like this one. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. I love reading your comments, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts.